All right. So with that and just some Zoom tech in the space, welcome again. I want to pass it off to my colleague Elizabeth Waitzig to do a bit of an opening about ETB before we pass it off to our presenters today.
Great. Thank you so much, Nancy. I just want to welcome you all into this space in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon, the day before Halloween, and in the middle of conference season. So thank you so much for being here with us. Just want to share with you a little bit about Expanding the Bench before we dive in. I co-direct Expanding the Bench with Angel Villalobos, and this is our amazing team of people who come together frequently who were just together at AEA to create space for our Expanding the Bench community. And we just had a great time and we did a lot of planning and we're very excited for the next year. So let me just tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do, and then I'll introduce our presenters for the day. So expanding the bench, you'll see the baseball metaphor there. Expanding the bench is a way to really center evaluators from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. We engage everyone in the practice of culturally responsive and equitable evaluation. And we believe that we are situated to connect folks in the evaluation ecosystem in three areas of focus for us. One is people, and you heard a little bit about the people. We're centering evaluators from diverse backgrounds. We're also interested in ensuring that all evaluators and all funders are well versed in the practice of Cree and what it means for them and where they sit. And then we also really think about not only programming for people in practice, but also for the field. So it's a supply and demand thing. If we are centering evaluators in the practice of Cree, we want to make sure that partners of or funders of evaluation both understand and practice culturally responsive and equitable practices so that in their partnerships with evaluators, there's space and room for Cree practice. So get to know us at expandingthebench.org. And now we'll talk a little bit about why we're here today. I was so excited to meet Melinda at a meeting last spring, and she talked about her work around listening to shift power, which is really interesting and exciting to me. And I thought, well, the Expanding the Bench community should probably know a little bit about this. And so Melinda Tuan and her colleague Katy Love have been very generous with their time and their ideas, and they've come to us so that we can learn about funder listening efforts across different foundation operations, so that we're building, they are building, we are all building and benefiting from a culture and practice of listening to shift power in philanthropy. They're going to share their work and lead a discussion around how we can systematically honor and ingrain diverse perspectives in the decisions that impact grant making, strategy setting, measurement, evaluation, and learning, all the things that you all care about. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Melinda and Katy with gratitude. And again, welcome you all to be here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that introduction, and Nancy and the rest of the Expanding the Bench team for all the background work to make this time possible. Welcome to those of you who are joining us via video recordings. Thank you for listening. As Elizabeth mentioned, I'm Melinda Tuan. I serve as the Managing Director of Fund for Shared Insight. I'm sitting in my home office with a white closet behind me. If you open the doors, it'd be full of office supplies and my clothes and everything. It's just a mess in there. I'm Asian American. I'm in my mid-50s. I have a little bit more white hair than I did 5 years ago and a short haircut. And I'm wearing a navy t-shirt because it's like 70 degrees outside in Philadelphia, which is where I live. And I'll just have Katy introduce herself as well.
This is Katy. Hi, everyone. I am so glad to join Melinda, and I see our colleague Jonathan is here too from Fund for Shared Insight. I use she, her pronouns. I am living on Ohlone land in Berkeley, California. It's kind of chilly here. And for a visual description, I am a white, middle-aged woman in my mid-40s with shoulder-length brown hair, a blouse with green blobs and a very pretty wallpaper behind me that's green with flowers, if I don't say so myself. I'm an independent consultant with Shared Insight, and I work with funders who are looking to shift power in their grant making, their governance, and yes, in their learning and evaluation work. So I'm really thrilled to make the connection of evaluation and learning with you today. Thank you, Melinda.
You're welcome. So what I'm going to do now is share some slides and we'll talk you through it. And we want to welcome you to ask questions in the chat as we go. So we don't end up just talking to you the entire time, but instead we can have conversation as we go, especially since we're a more intimate group here. So that is what we're going to do. We're going to talk about return to community, tools and resources to help funders listen to shift power. And we've already done our individual introductions. So we want to just start with a little poll here. Katie, what are the questions we want to ask folks?
Thank you, Melinda. So the poll, we're asking everyone to just tell us your primary role. Are you a funder, an evaluator, a capacity builder, or other? And if you're looking at us like, why do I have to choose? I'm both, I'm all. Just pick which role most is your primary identity for this conversation today, because that will help us understand who we're speaking with here. And I think we have almost full participation, maybe just a few more seconds. And I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Drum roll, please. You can see there is about a quarter of us here are funders, so that is good to keep in mind. 63% are kind of primarily evaluators. At least one person identified as a capacity building practitioner, and nobody selected other, so that is great to know. Again, we know you could be a funder, evaluator, capacity builder, all rolled into one, but this is helpful for us to just know a little bit about who's in the room. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Katie. So Fund for Shared Insight, we are a national funder collaborative. We have 16 funders at this moment who all contribute to a pooled fund. We're a sponsored project of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, and our mission really is around improving philanthropy. And the way that we want to do that is by having more leaders and staff in nonprofits and foundations listen and shift power to those most impacted by structural racism and systemic intersectional inequities. We really want to listen and shift power to people at the heart of our work. And if we achieve this goal, the impact that we seek is that communities and people most impacted, but least consulted by philanthropy and nonprofits are better off in ways they define for themselves. And I think this is where Elizabeth and I, when we first met, just felt this connection around the work that we're trying to do. Is I'm really lifting up the voices of those who philanthropy least consults. And yet so many decisions are made by philanthropy and nonprofits for communities when they don't have a say in it. Since some of you, a majority are evaluators, I thought you might enjoy seeing our theory of change. I'm not going to talk through every aspect of it, but as you will see, our main strategies for achieving this goal and our impact is through focusing on field building for feedback and listening, and then supporting foundation listening. And the way that we are going to do that and continue to do this since our founding in 2014 is to build a robust, sustainable field, to have more active champions and supporters of this work, and to build and support the development of high quality resources and examples to support behavior change among funders in particular. So we appreciate the opportunity to share with you today and hopefully engage some of you as champions and supporters of this work, and to help surface other resources and examples of funders who are listening to shift power, because ultimately our work is about helping funders listen to shift power. And now I'd like to turn it to my friend and colleague, Katie.
Thank you, Melinda. So if you go to the next slide, perfect. We want to share with you what we mean by listening well, which is the phrase that we use a lot. We know that many people know what listening is and define it in a certain way, but we're using it with a special definition here that we want to invite you to hear. Listening with a willingness to change in response to what you hear. Listening to a broad range of voices with specific attention to people and communities not typically consulted by philanthropy and nonprofits. Committing to an ongoing process, not a one-time activity, that includes closing the loop by reporting back on what you hear and how you plan to respond. And engaging with people and communities as partners throughout the process, from framing the initial questions to making meaning from what you hear to determining how to respond. Next slide. We also have evolved our own thinking as shared insight, and we are now talking about listening to shift power, where we're thinking about moving from power over to power with, towards self-determination and ownership by communities most impacted by structural racism and systemic intersectional inequities. So what we mean by that is that there needs to be a mindset shift to see and value the power inherent in individuals and communities and to decenter the outsized power of funders. We want to ensure that funders are embracing relationship and reciprocity, and there's a lot of very cool work we've seen in this direction. And we want to be explicit. We're not talking about just shifting power over to do so in reverse, where people who were traditionally perhaps at the bottom of that hierarchy now are at the top, and whoever was at the top was in the bottom. We're not talking about that we're moving to a power with model. We're also not simply changing organizational systems and processes. And this is not primarily about the power dynamic between the funder and the grantee. Next slide. So given that, we are going to ask our colleagues to launch another poll, which is based on that, how well do you think foundations are listening? This doesn't have to be an evidence-based answer, but we would love to hear your finger in the wind to how well you think foundations are listening. 1, they are not listening. Option 2, they're doing some listening. 3, they're listening well. Or 4, I don't know. And I see everyone has responded so quickly, which is great. I'm going to end the poll and share the shocking results that everyone agreed that foundations are doing some listening. So 100% feel that foundations overall are doing some listening. I'm sure this is quite hard to generalize about, but that's great to know. Thank you. And over to you, Melinda.
Thank you, Katy. One of the things that we talk about when we started this work in 2014 is a lot of funders were saying they were listening. We hypothesized that they were not listening well based on our definitions. In fact, like CEP did a survey in 2013 and 99% of foundations said they were listening. I don't know what happened to that 1%. But there were a lot of questions even at that time about whether it was the smart thing to do to listen to community. I spoke at a CEP, Center for Effective Philanthropy conference in 2016, when we brought some participants from the Center for Employment Opportunities, people who had come out of prison and were being placed in jobs. And they spoke at the conference. It was the first time they were participants of nonprofit programs who had spoken at this national conference. And after they talked about their experience of being listened to and the changes that the nonprofit they were a part of made as a result of their feedback, I actually had not one, but 2 people come up to me after the session and ask me what the cost benefit was of listening to people. Another person said, what is the social return on investment of listening to community? And I was so angry because we just heard from these participants about how giving feedback to the nonprofit and having the nonprofit change their program based on what they heard from the participants was such an empowering, meaningful experience and something that they were going to repeat over and over again at that nonprofit. And for funders to sit back and ask what was the cost benefit or social return on investment of listening to people was infuriating. Partially out of that, Faye Tversky, who was the co-chair of Shared Insight and was at Hewlett Foundation at the time, wrote this piece in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, talking about how it's time for what she called a 3-legged stool of measurement. And as you look at the visualization on a 3-legged stool that I have depicted on this slide, there's one leg, which is evaluation, and then a second leg, which is monitoring. And to date, that's been a lot of what evaluators have done over the past decades. And the argument that they made was that there needs to be a third leg to the stool, otherwise the stool won't stand, and only two legs to have really stable stool, and whether the seat is improvement or it's learning, that feedback from people experiencing the programs that funders are investing in is an important, equally important stool of this measurement effort. So evaluation, monitoring, and feedback. And that there are things that we learn from people by asking them directly that you can't learn from a pre-post outcome survey or from a randomized control trial. And there are challenges associated with this as well. Sometimes what people say about their experience is in conflict with what the research might show. And the argument that we make is that having that data allows us to have more fruitful, in-depth conversations about what happens if, for example, the research shows that individuals coming out of incarceration into work groups at the Center for Employment Opportunities need to be in multi-generational groups as opposed to same age groupings. So that was a conflict that they experienced. And it was really out of the conversations with the participants and understanding their perspectives that they decided to stick with multi-generational groups, because the participants said, if you put us all with people from our same age who have all come out of prison recently, we're not going to be as focused on our work and staying employed as hearing from folks who are older and who maybe have more wisdom to offer us. So that would be an example of sometimes where feedback from participants can be in conflict with what you might find from evaluation or research. But again, having these data are very important. And what we're measuring is in service of equity and hearing from people and shifting power to them so they have more say in what's happening in their lives. The CEO example is one that I'd like to give because they have been listening systematically to people in their programs across the 30 sites that they operate across the United States. And their participant feedback has given them a roadmap for change, changing simple things such as mandatory meeting times from 7 a.m. to later to make it more accessible for folks who have kids to get off to school, improving call center waiting times, laptops at CEO sites to help people access technology and learn how to use technology. And at the level where now they have people who are former participants who serve on their national board of directors. So truly shifting power to participants through listening in systematic, ongoing ways. And so when we talk about high quality feedback loops, listening to people in these comprehensive ways that are not extractive, that it might be helpful just to define what we mean by a high quality feedback loop. And we bring this example to you from our colleagues at Listen for Good, which is a capacity building program for nonprofits to help them systematically listen to the people they serve in their programs. Shared Insight incubated Listen for Good and launched it in 2015. And Listen for Good has now helped more than 1,000 nonprofits listen to over 230,000 individuals across the United States. And based on this diagram from Listen for Good, they use a survey as a way of listening to folks. But the 5 steps include designing the survey and developing that survey that focuses on the client experience. Then collecting the data and making sure that you're tailoring your data collection methods to the client context. Enlisting participants who will take the surveys and helping you design the survey, making sure the language is appropriate, the reading levels, the translation of the languages that you're using. Third step is interpreting the data and drawing key insights from the data, paying close attention to the experience of the voices that are least heard, even amongst this set of folks that are not listened to typically by philanthropy. And again, engaging participants in interpreting the data that they themselves participated in giving and from their own peers. Fourth step is to make course corrections and what you're doing informed by the feedback. Again, engaging participants and making suggestions. Given the data that we've seen and how we've analyzed it, how should this program be operated differently, or what new programs need to be started? And then the fifth and most important step is actually closing the loop. So going back to the folks who gave the feedback and sharing back what you heard, what you're going to do about it. And in cases where you don't have a plan or a way to do something about it, saying, here's what we heard, and this is why we can't make the changes that you suggested. And enlisting, again, participants and partnering with you. So we really talk about moving people from being participants to being partners in the work. So that overall is what we talk about in terms of defining what a high quality feedback loop is. And that it's really essential to think through each of these steps about how you're going to involve program participants, making sure that their perspective is part of every step and that you're paying attention to the voices that are often least heard by funders, not because they're not speaking, but because we're not listening. I love this quote from this young woman from PACE Center for Girls in Florida. And she just says, and there's a beautiful picture of Zuriel who has curly black hair and she's wearing a gray PACE Center for Girls t-shirt with their logo, which is a heart in the shape of a butterfly. And she says, if you're going to the same place every single day, you don't want to feel like nobody listens. You don't want to feel small. I think it's important for people to feel they're heard and they're significant. And what's significant about PACE Center for Girls is that they are implementing Listen for Good with the teenage girls in their program. And in addition to all that they've learned from listening to the girls, they've recently conducted a study of the role of participatory approaches in program design and measurement. And they really found that establishing feedback loops with the participants, these teenage girls, ultimately helped their organization and other organizations that they studied and funders to collect the evidence to determine if the problems they aim to solve are truly addressing the relevant needs specific to their communities. And there's a great article about this on Giving Compass. Their research also found that not only did high quality feedback reveal causal links to outcomes, but also that high quality feedback influenced a more inclusive, resilient culture within organizations. As a result of their own participatory research, PACE created girls' leadership councils and a statewide council representing each site. And those councils helped design, execute, and interpret program research and evaluation. They conducted focus groups with peers. They aided in interviewing new hires on staff, and they contributed to program decisions. And the deep engagement from the girls not only benefited the girls, which is their mission at PACE, but also has motivated the staff. So staff turnover declined by nearly 2/3 within 5 years, and productivity and engagement increased by more than 1/4 during this time that they embraced participatory methods. In addition, embracing this culture of feedback and equity at PACE really served the organization well during the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. Well, many organizations that we know of, and you probably know of too, struggled with how to communicate with their participants during the pandemic and after those horrible days after George Floyd's murder. The fact that they'd already embraced this culture of feedback and equity helped them and the staff process these events with the girls. And they already had trusting relationships with the girls and communication forums in place for them to be able to talk together openly about the issues of racism and police brutality. It's just a very powerful story with PACE. The PACE example demonstrates how high quality feedback is the smart thing to do. And thankfully, I'm not having these conversations with funders anymore about whether there's a cost benefit positive to being able to listen to community. So those are no longer the conversations we're having, but people were still asking, is it the smart thing to do? Can you tell me that collecting feedback and listening to community will result in better outcomes? So we funded a portfolio of 6 organizations, including PACE, including CEO, to research this very question of whether there is a relationship between feedback and outcomes. And yay, what we learned is that the findings across the organizations indicate there is indeed a relationship and that addressing feedback from participants can result in better outcomes in the future. And you don't have to wait for the results of a pre-post outcome analysis or an RCT. And in fact, you can make changes to your program as you're hearing from participants along the way. We have several different studies across this group of 6. different kinds of outcomes, because Boys and Girls Clubs was dealing with student perceptions being predictive of academic performance. Youth Truth, which is a national youth survey organization, found that student perceptions of longing and collaboration are predictive of reading proficiency and suspension rates. CEO, we talked about already with other outcomes, but participants who responded to texts were more likely to be employed 90 or 180 days after initial employment. And they found that the act of providing feedback in and of itself is associated with positive outcomes for those same participants. And then PACE, as I mentioned, found that providing feedback contributed to the program participants' progression and how they use their voices and speak up in leadership roles, which is the mission of PACE. Last example is from Rediff and working with RTI, and they found that perceptual feedback is predictive of outcomes for the participants in their employment social enterprises. So with these research pieces, and I'm pleased to say that Penny Huang, who's on our team, is our evaluation and research manager, and she's going to be joining us when she's off our next call, but she was the one that oversaw all of this research, and she is affiliated with Expanding the Bench and is one of the coaches. So just wanted to give you that encapsulation of the feedback research that we've done and how it is related to outcomes and why it is a smart thing to do to listen to participants and people. And now I'll turn it back to Katy.
Thank you, Melinda. It's great to hear those examples. So as you've heard from Melinda, most funders now agree that listening to their community is the right thing to do and the smart thing to do. So there's less work in convincing them. And thankfully, they're now asking, how do we do this? How can we listen to our community? Next slide. On this slide, you'll see an image of several of the tools that Shared Insight has been a part of, either leading the development on or supporting the development of these. And there's 5 of them here that we want to highlight to you as resources that help funders listen to shift power. There's Listen for Good, which Melinda has told you a little bit about. There's ProInspire's Here to Listen, Shared Insight's Funder Listening Action Menu, Shared Insight's Participatory Philanthropy Toolkit, and the Advancing Participation in Philanthropy Toolkit. So there's a lot more to explore here for any of you that check that funder box or that are interested in supporting funders to listen to shift power. There's several tools here and more as well. Next slide. So one of the ways that funders can listen to community is through their grantees. Melinda told you a little bit about Listen for Good, which is a capacity building program for nonprofits that's served over 1,000 organizations to date and has amplified the voices of 230,000 individuals across the US. Listen for Good employs high-quality feedback loops that Melinda described with the people in the nonprofit programs and engage funders in hearing what the participants have to say and responding to what they hear. Next slide. I also mentioned Here to Listen, which is by ProInspire, created as a set of cards by ProInspire and helps foundations build and deepen their equity-centered practices. The program guides participants through day-to-day practices that embody racial equity values so that they can show up better in conversations with their colleagues, with their grantees, and their community members. Foundations learn how to apply a racial equity and power analysis to their listening, communication, and feedback styles. Next slide. Another tool is the Fund for Shared Insight Funder Listening Action Menu, which helps funders listen and act on what they hear. Next slide, please. Here, over to you, Melinda, to describe this one.
Great. We are in the midst of improving this. We're constantly improving this particular tool because we want to highlight examples of funders that are doing the things that we want other funders to do. And we also want to make sure that the resources that we're referencing are more evergreen. Right now, we have these 6 categories of ways that funders can listen. And I want to just highlight that the third one about listening to inform measurement, learning, and evaluation is probably most relevant to this audience on the webinar and those of you who are watching the video recording. And so I wanted to highlight for you what that looks like in the tool, just a few examples of funders that are changing and then focus specifically on the measurement and learning. So with grant making, we see that organizations such as Brooklyn Org has switched to all of its grant making being conducted in partnership with community. There's a way of listening to shift power through the way foundation staff the foundation, the Hilton Foundation being an example of one that has hired interns, employees, and consultants who have relevant lived experience. There's a way of listening to shift power in your governance of a foundation by bringing people with relevant lived experience onto the board and creating community advisory boards. Those are all examples of just a few funders and how they're changing, and we're constantly looking for more examples across all the categories of our funder listening action menu. And in particular, for this one category about how can you listen to shift power in your measurement, learning, and evaluation, we have a few resources we've identified that we think funders should be able to access to be able to learn more about how to shift power in their measurement, learning, and evaluation. And we're eager to find more examples of funders who are doing this kind of work. So if you in your network and the work that you're doing with funders can suggest to us examples of funders that are actually listening to shift power in their MLE work, we would love to have those examples be highlighted. And we have a team of communications folks who write up stories and case studies. So all we need is just a name and a contact, and our team can run with that. So now I will turn it back to Katy.
Now you'll see an image of our Participatory Philanthropy Toolkit, which is designed for funders to embrace participatory practices. It includes key insights and recommendations, a funder readiness assessment, resources for funders ready to go, which are like templates and checklists, and much, much more. So if you're interested in seeing what participation looks like in philanthropy, this is a great place to start. Next slide. This tool now is the Advancing Participation in Philanthropy tool, which is another word about participation in philanthropy. And this tool was developed by me and my colleague and friend, Diana Samarison, who's the founding executive director of the Disability Rights Fund. And the way this tool works is it looks at all of the places where a foundation can invite participation in its work, from its grant making to its governance, to its communications, and yes, to its monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And so here you'll see part of the tool here. This is not the complete portion of the tool on the MEL page, but to give you a sense of what you'll see when you find here, there also are a number of other resources listed on this page that will give you more resources, like another one you might have heard of, which is the Participatory Learning Tool by Engage R&D, which has recently come out, and a really good one to think about for participatory monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And that sums up on the next slide. That sums up a long list of tools that we wanted to share with you, and examples and ideas to spark some thinking. We wanted to open it up to see if folks have any other questions. I want to really thank you, Jonathan, and others who have put some responses to the questions in the chat. But are there other questions that you're wondering about that you would like to ask?
I'm going through some of the things in the chat. I love that Miranda says she was working at a CBO when Faye's article came out. It was truly a beacon of light and great to share with funders.
I did have a question. And first of all, I just appreciate the growth of funders, and this whole view that participatory and community input is not rhetorical. But in light of the world we live in and the country we live in, I often get concerned of how stale our view of power is. And I know we've been looking at shifting power, defining power, and I appreciate the efforts. But I am so convinced that I feel like the time that I brush my teeth, it has already changed. Just that element of power, and how poisonous it's become and rhetorical that it's become. And I just, and I know we cannot instantly evolve all at the same time, but I just caution us to realize how dehumanizing the issue of power has always been. And some of those ethical aspects, whether we're talking about Plato, Aristotle, whatever, I just keep thinking of Saint Aquinas, which he says, give up your power to no one. And it doesn't matter how brilliant a person is or their position from a paternalistic view. And I just hope that as we're doing this work, and particularly the participants, which I call all of them, it doesn't matter their title, as invested social investors, that we never stop learning, one, the danger of toxic power, and that we're always evolving to formalize something better as we move, whether it's generation to generation, decade to decade, it doesn't matter, just how important it really, really is.
I appreciate those comments, Sharon, and the reflections on power have been something that we have been discussing for quite some time. And I've asked my colleague Jonathan, who is much better than I am at putting things into the chat and link, because I have several screens open. Anyway, he'll put this in the chat. But we just issued a blog post reflecting on our definitions of what we mean by power. And I'm just going to read out just a part of it, which does require like a reframing, because I think a lot of us have a typical Western definition of power, which is, quote, having the discretion and the means to asymmetrically enforce one's will over entities, quote unquote. So in an institutional context, philanthropy historically and currently has both the discretion and the means to exercise power. Discretion meaning we can define our mission, establish priorities, control the conditions under which funds are granted, and the means, financial resources, to exercise power. So it's very asymmetrical, this definition of Western power. Philanthropy has much more power than grantees and communities in this definition. But what we are trying to argue with, and what we'd like funders to embrace, and thank you, Jonathan, for putting the link in the chat, is that this relatively narrow conception of power, which equates power with money, control of processes, and control over others, is maybe one of the biggest barriers that prevents funders from shifting power. Because like they have it, we want to hold it. And our recent learnings and experiences, especially around our participatory grant-making initiative, expanded our thinking and helped us understand that there are many other ways to define and conceive of power. And in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s autobiography, he wrote, quote, power, properly understood, is the ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, or economic changes, unquote. And so he defines power as the ability to achieve purpose and affect change. So power is not control or possession of resources or control over people, but it's in the context of philanthropy, it's a reminder that foundations by ourselves, however high-minded or well-intentioned, we do not inherently hold or wield this type of power, according to Dr. King. Funders can only achieve their purposes, especially purposes oriented towards justice and liberation, by working in partnership with others. So like if we could shift funders to like embrace that definition that King gave us many years ago about what true power is, we'd be living in a different world. But that is the world that we seek as Fund for Shared Insight, is that kind of understanding and embracing that power is not over, power is with, to achieve purpose and to achieve the changes that we seek. Yeah. Right, there are a lot of questions. I want to make sure we're answering some of them. I'm looking at, Katie, I'm looking at Nicole's question about what recommendations would you give for program officers who want to make participatory changes, but the funder's leadership may be resistant.
Yes, I have put some comments in the chat, but in general, I do think that the most important thing to think about is getting support for the program officer, because there's now a lot of tools and webinars and podcasts and, books like Decolonizing Wealth and Winners Take All that are really making the case to funders that it's time to make some big changes in philanthropy. And certainly part of that is reconsidering this power, to link it back to the other question. So there are many, many materials out there. The participatory grant-making community is a global, free, open access community that has a tremendous amount of resources on its webpage. And if you're looking for anything in particular, like for health and environment funders or for funders working with children and youth, there's almost definitely someone in that space who's doing this. So if you reach out to me with, even in the chat, with more context, I can try to point you in some good directions. We also know that funders sometimes want to see their peers doing this work. And while many funders like to be those innovators and risk takers, there are others who kind of want to wait to see what happens. So sometimes putting funders with other funders who are doing similar work is a good way to show folks it's not only possible, it's good grant making practice too.
Liz, I'd like to shine a light on the question that you put in. Can you talk more about, I was presenting many slides that had links to resources that you couldn't see. So can you just voice over your question here?
Sure. My question was a couple slides ago, you had a set of bullet points of just some different resources that you guys were recommending. And one of them really caught my attention because I just came a couple weeks ago with the Minnesota Council for Nonprofits and the Minnesota Council on Foundations had a joint conference. And at that conference, there were a couple of sessions that really focused on Indigenous data sovereignty and listening to tribal nations and Native communities around the power of data, the power of knowledge, the power of evaluation, and frankly, the history, both past and current, about exploitation and extraction of data and evaluation of resources. And so anyway, it just caught my attention that you had noted some work around Indigenous data sovereignty as being a key resource. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about that resource specifically, or about how the principles around data sovereignty with Indigenous communities connect to the practice of listening and power sharing.
Well, why don't I talk a little bit about how we came up with some of these resources, and then Katie, if you have more to add about this particular resource. We have a team of folks on our Shared Insight team that have been working on curating through the many, many, many different resources that are out there to find the ones that are most relevant to this work around listening to shift power from funders to community. And we also have been working in concert with 12 PSO partners. We just wrapped up today a 2 to 4 year, depending on how many organizations participated over that 4 year period, working with partners such as Native Americans in Philanthropy, who also were helping us to curate this list of recommended resources. So I think the Indigenous data sovereignty principles and the decolonized data, oh, this typo on my slide, but those came through NAP as well as through other resources. Katie, you want to add to that?
No, I don't want to add anything substantial. I think that it's really important. The points that you just made are really important. And I think there's a lot of assumptions that we've seen made in philanthropy, especially as they relate to participation, like assuming anything about anyone's interest, any community's interest in participation is not a good move. Don't make assumptions. You know what they say about that. So it is really good practice to really do homework for funders and to really begin to or continue to educate ourselves about who are the communities we're working with and how can we understand some of these practices and principles, the harmful past, the harmful exploitation of the past, and really look together for what's needed now. And listening needs to be a part of that, but it needs to be done in non-extractive ways.
And I should mention too, this resource that we're presenting on is currently, as I think I said, we're reworking it in significant ways. We're trying to make it more accessible. There's different like doorways that funders can walk through, whether it's by role and function area, or by particular listening practice, or by some reflection questions that we think everyone should be contemplating, like who are the communities that we're serving? And how do you define that? And what power do I have as an individual and how do I wield it? And then what power does my institution as a funder have and how are we building it? So there are a variety of different ways and resources and examples that we're trying to populate in this revamped funder listening action menu tool. And I'm looking at backwards through some of these other comments. I think Art, you had several comments here. Is there one that you would like to voice over?
Well, just thank you for bringing this up and being, champions and advocates. I think for the longest time, we always worked on, evaluated, and researched people and communities, and we never considered the people and communities we were working with. So thanks, congratulations, kudos, and look forward to more and continuing great things.
Thank you, Art. And if you have suggestions about how we can further this work, engage y'all as champion supporters of this work. We are eager to have more folks talking about this work and the importance of listening to community, shifting power to community in the ways that Sharon brought up and that we were discussing.
Well, I do think one thing, if I can follow up, and I think the notion is to move from problems to people. Move from accountability and outcomes to learning and acting from learning, right? And just kind of reframe a lot of the fundamental notions and foundations from which we've done our work historically, right? Just be different, do different, and achieve different.
Thank you, Art. I think I've captured the questions that came up in the chat, but if there's someone who chatted something in that I've missed, please feel free to voice that. Or if there are other questions that folks have, we'd love to hear it.
I was just thinking about what Elizabeth had asked, and one of the things that I would love to bring your eyes to is this Participatory Philanthropy Toolkit, which really came from an initiative we did in Fund for Shared Insights Participatory Climate Initiative. And some of these practices I think are important and related to what you were talking about, Elizabeth, because when we started with this initiative, the funders said, okay, we're going to let the community define what we mean. We're just going to ask that this be focused around climate. And right away, as we started talking to the people who were most impacted by climate change, one of those communities being coastal indigenous communities in Alaska and Hawaii, and not only coastal communities, told us that even this framing of climate change, this language, did not resonate at all. That when they were thinking about what we had described to them, this kind of concept of climate change, they were thinking about land stewardship. They were thinking about language. They were thinking about traditional ecological knowledge. And so I think from the very beginning, we were really challenged in using some of the basic, standard practices in philanthropy. And so if you take a look at that toolkit, the key insights and recommendations, hopefully you'll see a lot of those learnings that I think are really relevant to both foundation context, evaluation context, and certainly foundation evaluation context too, thinking about how we use frameworks in non-helpful ways, even as we use them as guardrails to make in foundations, what we think of as fair decisions. A lot of the communities that we serve will often find those frameworks, that language, not helpful at all. So anyway, I was thinking about that as you were talking about that particular resource, and this topic of data sovereignty came up quite a lot with the participant group, which was included Indigenous peoples from both Alaska and Hawaii, and they were very, they stress this issue a lot.
Any other questions for us? Because if not, then we have a question for you. All right, here's our question for you. What do you think are the challenges associated with funders, if you work with funders around evaluation, listening to community in their measurement, learning, and evaluation work? And also, how can we counter those challenges? We're looking for advice from you all.
I can offer up one challenge that I know we're grappling with it in the MACP context. So at Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies, I think one of the challenges, like people have rhetoric of like we want to listen to community, but where they struggle is some teams don't have geographically defined communities or like so basically the struggle is just even defining what the community is that is connected to their work and their strategies. And so I think that's been a surprisingly hard challenge, despite the fact that there's been, a decade of grant making in some cases for some of the strategies, and the communities aren't necessarily defined in consistent ways across the organization. And so the approaches then might look very, very different.
I think just the sobriety of the reality that there's so much to dismantle. And to me, I think it is challenging because you automatically, when you take on this as authentic as the intent is, there are these aspects, I think, of shame and blame and guilt. And that within itself is depleting. And so I really think that cross-pollination of communication, of affirming efforts, and even if it's taking that rusty nail that's been so structural and systemic and just showing inches, right? Whatever it is that you're doing, documenting that, curating that, putting it in ways, because I think shame, blame, and guilt, to me, doesn't help anybody. It's acknowledgement, and also the acknowledgement of I'm accountable and I'm making efforts. And that, even if we have those barometers, you do like we reach our goal of $100 million and this is where we're at, honestly saying this is where we're at our dismantling. And at least from a visual perspective, a 5-year-old can see progress is being made, because I don't think that we celebrate, just because of the topic we're talking about, milestones, even if they're small. I think doing nothing has so many generational problems to it, but doing something and not even being accredited for it, it's like a slap in the face in many ways. We assume just because there is this presumption of power with the vote, with the money, that the heart, right, is corroded in some way. These false narratives that we have on either side, which actually, I think continues to perpetuate this cycle as we are doing. But what we're doing doesn't seem to be fast enough, good enough. And so the conflicts, and so that conflict resolution from a mature perspective just needs to happen, in my opinion. And the excuses, the blame, the assumptions, I know it's part of our human perspective, but they get in the way of real honest conversations. And I just get reminded of probably telling my age, but the movie where it says you can't handle the truth, that's a real statement. That's a real statement. We can't. And we have to acknowledge that, right? It's hard to acknowledge, but it's true. Sometimes we can't handle the truth, but the truth has to be handled if we are to continue dismantling those long, deep, systemic and structural nails with this fake perspective that we deshumanize, and it's okay. It's gonna make me go back and look at some old Netflix movies.
You good man, Jack Nicholson. You're on mute, Melinda.
Thank you again for having me and for Katy joining me with us and our colleagues, Jonathan and Penny. And I would like to turn it over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Melinda. Thank you, Katy. Thank you, Jonathan and Penny. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I think one of the things that struck me is how integrated listening well and culturally responsive and equitable evaluation are. They're very similar practices and they need each other. I also really was struck by how hard it is for us to listen well and how important it is at the same time. And I'm just wondering what contextual factors are out there, like time, resources, achievement, so many things. We've got work to do, folks. I think we're up to it though. And Melinda and Katy, for all the work that you've done to support us and give us language and frameworks and thinking within our expanding the bench community. For that, we are truly grateful. Thank you also to the ETB team for doing all the logistical support to make this happen. Nancy, Nada, Manny, I really appreciate you and value you. And thank you to you all for spending an hour with us. We did record this and we will be putting it out into the world because we're hoping that people will listen well to all of the wisdom that was expressed here. So thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you soon on another session at some point. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you.